chosen by the Ice King, hiding her horned secret. The Hall of Unwanted Brides was the last place a woman went before the world stopped pretending she still had choices. Everyone in Vareth knew that, even if they used prettier names in public. The nobles called it the final choosing. Priests called it the mercy rite. Matchmakers called it a practical necessity. But the women who were brought there knew the truth. It was an auction with silk draped over it. A market with incense burned to hide the smell of desperation. The great hall blazed with chandeliers and gold lamps, but the light only made the shame clearer. On the raised platform stood 7 women. One had lines around her eyes and fingers that trembled every time the auctioneer praised her mature grace. Another carried an old scar down one side of her face and stared at the crowd with such open hatred that no man dared meet her eyes for long. A third, heavily veiled in pale linen, kept pressing one hand over her belly as if she could hide the fact that she had been abandoned while carrying another man's child. And at the very end of the line stood the woman everyone whispered about. She wore a midnight blue cloak from head to toe. A heavy hood shadowed her face, and beneath it hung a black silver thread veil so thick not even the outline of her mouth could be seen. Gloves hid her hands. The fabric around her shoulders was carefully folded to disguise the shape of what lay beneath. "What is wrong with her?" a merchant whispered from the front row. "Burned, perhaps. No one hides like that for scars." "A curse, then. Or she's one of those horned things from the southern coasts." The whisper spread, ugly and eager. Beneath the hood, Isolde kept her breathing steady by force. She had learned years ago that humiliation was easier to survive if you met it very still. Stillness made people uneasy. It denied them the pleasure of seeing your panic. So while the other women shifted and trembled and pleaded silently with their eyes, Isolde stood straight, gloved hands folded before her, as if she had chosen to be there. She had not. Her father stood below the platform near the carved stone pillars, one hand clasped behind his back, his mouth set in the hard line he wore whenever she embarrassed him by existing. Beside him stood her younger sister, Elira, who looked exactly like what noble poets like to describe: fair skin, honey-gold hair, soft mouth, large eyes full of anxious feeling. Men looked at Elira and imagined spring. Men looked at Isolde and imagined a warning in an old story. The iron collar around Isolde's throat bit cold into her skin. Most people thought it was ornamental. It was not. It was a binding collar, etched on the inside with runes to weaken sorcery and suppress inherited magic. Her father had locked it around her neck when she was 17, the night he had publicly declared that whatever strangeness had tainted her had come from her dead mother's blood and would be contained if decency still ruled the world. Contained. That was the word cruel men liked best when they meant broken. Under the hood, 2 smooth horns curved back from Isolde's temples. Not large, not monstrous, nothing like the antlers children sketched when mocking her. They were elegant, dark at the base and lighter at the tips, polished naturally with age and wear. Her skin was deep blue, rich as twilight over the sea. Her eyes were silver gray, startling against the darkness of her lashes. Her mother had once told her she looked like moonlight sinking into deep water. Her father had called her a stain. The auctioneer cleared his throat and droned on in the lifeless voice of a man selling furniture he did not particularly like. Lady Rena of House Valls, 29 years of age, healthy, accomplished in household management, no issue, modest Dow. A low bid came. Rena was led away with tears in her eyes. Another woman received 2 bids and left with a merchant old enough to be her grandfather. Then there was a long stretch in which no one offered for anyone at all, and the silence grew heavy enough to bruise. Isolde knew what would happen if no one chose her. Her father had explained it with insulting calm. There were mining houses in the eastern cliffs that needed labor. Border keeps that required laundresses and breeding women. Southern caravans where unusual-looking slaves fetched decent coin as curiosities. Since no decent house would marry a horned blue daughter once rumors had spread, he would at least recover what she had cost him. She had nodded then. She had not begged. She would not beg now. The auctioneer moved down the line. Lady is. The doors at the back of the hall opened. The sound cracked through the chamber like a blade drawn over stone. Every voice stopped. Cold entered first. Not the ordinary draft of winter air from outside. This cold had weight. It rolled through the hall in a clean, sharp wave and made every wolfhound chained by the doors flatten their ears and whine. Men straightened instinctively. Women looked up. Even the candles nearest the aisle trembled. Then the king walked in. King Lucien of Norvale was not supposed to be there. Kings did not attend halls like this. They did not choose from rejected women and discarded daughters. They married princesses, sealed treaties, produced heirs beneath cathedral glass and banners. They certainly did not appear unannounced at what was essentially a marketplace for shame. Yet there he was. Tall. Pale. Wrapped in black wool and winter-white fur. His hair, silver blonde and straight, brushed the collar of his coat. He wore no crown, only a narrow band of dark metal across his brow. His face was beautiful in the cold way a blade could be beautiful, too precise, too sharp, too dangerous to be soft. And his eyes, when the light caught them, were the pale gray of storm clouds frozen over a northern sea. Whispers burst around the room. The Ice King. What is he doing here? Impossible. I heard he hasn't even courted a bride. Maybe he's here for political inspection. Of a bride auction? No one had a sensible answer. Lucien did not pause for anyone's astonishment. He walked down the central aisle as if he owned every breath in the room, which of course he did. Nobles bowed too late. The auctioneer nearly dropped his ledger. Your Majesty, the man stammered. We are deeply honored. Continue, said the king. His voice was low and even, but there was something in it that killed argument before it was born. The auctioneer swallowed. Why yes, Your Majesty. He resumed in a shaking tone. The crowd's attention, however, had shifted completely. Nobody cared what names were being read now. Every eye followed the king. Lucien stopped before the first woman on the platform. Looked at her. Moved on. Stopped before the second. Moved on. At the third, the pregnant one, he paused slightly longer. Isolde's pulse ticked harder against the iron collar. Then he kept moving. The hall held its breath. He came to the end of the line. Stopped directly in front of Isolde. For one heartbeat she could hear nothing. Not the candles, not the whisper of silk, not the small terrified breaths of the women beside her. Only the pounding of her own blood and the unnerving stillness of the man now standing a few feet away. She kept her head lowered. If he asked for the veil, everything would end here. He would look. He would understand. The hall would see his expression and feast on it for years. Instead, after a silence stretched almost to cruelty, the king said, with complete calm. I choose her. The entire hall erupted. What? The veiled one? Has he lost his mind? There must be some mistake. Below the platform, Isolde's father lurched forward. Your Majesty, I must protest. Lucien did not even glance at him. Must you? The old lord faltered. There are facts about my daughter that you have not been told. I selected her, not you. The words landed like a slap. Isolde looked up before she meant to. Through the thick black silver thread veil, she could make out his face only dimly, but she felt his gaze meet hers with unnerving precision. Not curious. Not disgusted. Not pitying. Certain. The auctioneer squeaked, the king has made his claim. Lady Isolde of House Marin is awarded by royal right. Awarded. The word made her stomach turn. Still, when the platform steward came to help her down, Isolde stepped away from the line without hesitation. Anything was better than staying. Anything was better than her father's hands closing around her future again. As she reached the floor, her father took a step toward her. Isolde. Lucien spoke without raising his voice. Do not. The command froze everyone nearby. Her father swallowed. Your Majesty, at least permit me a private word. If you knew what she is. This time Lucien did look at him. Cold sharpened in the room. I know, he said. At minimum, I know enough to see what sort of man would bring his own daughter here in a binding collar. Silence hit like a dropped curtain. Isolde forgot to breathe. So did her father, apparently. His face went first red, then bone white. The king turned his attention back to her. Can you walk? The ordinary question nearly undid her. Yes, she said. Good. He held out a gloved hand. A king's hand. To her. For a wild instant she simply stared at it. Then she placed her gloved fingers in his and let him lead her out of the hall while behind them the room burst into a chaos of whispers that would feed the kingdom for months. The royal carriage smelled of leather, pine smoke, and winter. Isolde sat opposite King Lucien with her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Outside, the city of Draven slid by beneath evening snow, narrow stone streets, roofs silvered white, lanterns glowing in windows, the river black as polished metal under the bridges. Inside the carriage, silence stretched. Lucien seemed perfectly at ease in it. He sat with one shoulder angled toward the frosted window, long fingers resting against the black wool of his coat. Even seated, he seemed too composed for ordinary humanity. At last Isolde said, You should know I did not deceive you willingly. He turned his head. The veil, she clarified. Had I any real choice in how I came to that hall, I would not have come at all. You were not required to explain that, he said. Most men would ask what I am hiding. I am not most men. Something in the way he said it made her huff out the faintest breath of near laughter. No, she said. You are not. He studied her for a moment. You expected I would demand the veil. Yes. And if I had? I would have refused. One pale brow lifted. In front of the entire hall. Yes. You would have caused a scandal. I was born one. The answer slipped out before she could soften it. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly. Interest, perhaps. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the iron collar visible above the neckline of her cloak. How long has your father kept that on you? Isolde went still. Most people knew a collar when they saw one. Very few recognized a magical restraint on sight. You know what it is, she said. Yes. The single word told her nothing and far too much at once. 7 years, she answered quietly. His jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but real. And no one objected. She stared at him through the veil. You say that as if people object when powerful men are cruel to women they own. I do not recognize that man as powerful. The word struck harder than any grand comfort could have. She looked down at her hands before he saw too much in her silence. Why did you choose me? Outside, snow hissed against the carriage wheels. When he answered, his tone was maddeningly calm. Because I need a wife. Because the kingdom needs an heir. Because the women at that hall were being measured like livestock and you were the only one standing there as if you might bite the room before letting it break you. Heat rose unexpectedly behind Isolde's eyes. That is not a kind answer. It was not intended as one. Then what was it? The truth. The carriage rocked over a patch of uneven stone. Isolde braced one hand against the seat. Lucien's gaze stayed on her, cool and unreadable. And if the truth changes once you know more? She asked. I have no intention of asking you to remove your veil. Her head lifted sharply. He continued, not tonight. Not before marriage. Not after it. Not ever, unless you choose otherwise. She forgot for a moment that breathing was something a body had to remember. You would marry me without seeing my face? Yes. That is absurd. Many political marriages are. I mean truly. A pause. Then, yes. The bluntness of it shattered something inside her that she had been holding tight for years. Not because she believed him completely yet. Because she wanted to. She turned her head toward the window, watching the city lights blur behind frost. You know, this makes you sound half mad. I have been called worse. By whom? My counsel, usually. That was dry enough to surprise a sound from her that really was laughter this time, brief, startled, almost painful. His expression did not change, but she thought she saw some small easing around the mouth, as if he had heard the sound and filed it away. When the palace finally rose ahead of them, black stone and white towers lit gold against the darkening sky, Isolde's stomach tightened all over again. This is the part, she murmured, where I wake up and discover I am still on that platform. Then continue not waking, he said as the carriage slowed. It is inconvenient for my plans. The palace of Norvale was vast and severe, built for a people who admired strength more than softness. Dark stone corridors. Carved ice-glass windows. Stair rails shaped like twisting branches in winter. Fires burned in every brazier, yet the palace never lost the feeling of cold held carefully in its bones. Servants bowed as the king passed. Their eyes, though trained downward, flicked toward Isolde's veil with naked curiosity. She braced for mockery. It never came. Lucien led her through a wing of private chambers far from the central court. At last he stopped before a pair of tall doors carved with mountain pines and wolves. These are yours. A steward opened them. Isolde stepped into warmth. A fire burned in a broad hearth. Thick rugs softened the floor. A copper bath steamed behind a folding screen. A supper tray waited by the window with broth, warm bread, tea, dried figs, and winter pears. The bed curtains were deep green velvet. Another door stood half open to reveal a smaller adjoining dressing room lined with cedar wardrobes. She turned slowly, taking it in. This is too much. It is adequate. For a king, perhaps. For the daughter of a man who had once made her eat alone in the back solar so guests would not see her face at table, it was absurd. Lucien stood at the threshold, one hand still on the edge of the door. Tomorrow morning there will be a contract council. My advisors will attend. So will your father. If there are terms you require, state them. Isolde blinked. Require? Yes. As in. I may ask for conditions. As in you may insist on them. No one had ever said that to her before. She could not think of anything witty or self-protective enough to hide how deeply it shook her. So she said the truth. I don't know what to ask for. His gaze flicked once more to the collar at her throat. Then begin there. With that, he turned to go. Wait, she said. He paused. If we do this, she asked, if I become your wife, will you ask me for children and nothing else? The question hung between them with more nakedness than either of them had prepared for. Lucien answered after a moment. I will ask you for honesty where possible. Courtesy where necessary. An heir if fate allows. And no more of yourself than you choose to give. Then he left her standing in the glow of the fire, staring after him and understanding, for the first time in her life, how terrifying mercy could be. The next morning she met the palace maids assigned to her. They were blind. Both of them. Older women with gentle hands, practical voices, and the calm efficiency of people who had seen every variety of misery and learned not to make theater of any of it. They dressed her without once fumbling in surprise at the shape of her horns beneath the wrappings, without asking if she needed them hidden differently, without offering false pity so sweet it turned rotten on contact. When one of them, Mara, fastened the veil and cloak, she clicked her tongue softly at the iron collar. Ugly thing. The other maid, Tessa, snorted. That one belongs in a furnace. Isolde stared. The king chose you for me. Mara smiled. He said you valued privacy. I do. And His Majesty, Tessa said dryly, is annoyingly thorough. By the time they led her to the council chamber, Isolde was calmer than she had any right to be. The calm lasted until she saw her father. Lord Marin stood at the far end of the long blackwood table with his face arranged into respectful outrage. Her sister stood behind him, pale and miserable. 3 royal councillors sat to the king's right, 2 to his left. Lucien occupied the head of the table, dark-clad and still as carved ice. When Isolde entered, every gaze turned toward her. "My lady," said one councillor stiffly. "Please sit." "My future queen," Lucien corrected. A small silence followed. Isolde took the chair indicated. Her father waited only until the clerk had laid out the marriage document before speaking. "Your Majesty," he said, "before any formal agreement is signed, I must object. My daughter has concealed material facts." "Has she?" Lucien said. "She hides her face. Her form. Her condition." Condition. The word made heat flash angrily under the binding collar. Lucien said, "And yet I selected her. With incomplete knowledge. From what I saw yesterday, your concern for completeness arrived very late in her life." One of the councillors coughed into his hand. Lord Marin's mouth tightened. "You do not understand what she is." "No," said the king, "but I understand exactly what you are." That dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Her father flushed. "I beg your pardon." A man willing to collar his own daughter and sell her to the highest bidder once hiding her became inconvenient. Isolde's fingers dug into the underside of the table. Her father took a step forward. "I acted to protect my house. You acted to spare your vanity." The king looked at Isolde. "Do you wish legal separation from your father's authority?" She had not prepared for the speed of her own answer. "Yes." Lord Marin wheeled toward her. "Isolde." Lucien did not raise his voice. "Do not interrupt my future queen again." Silence. The king nodded to the clerk. "Record it." Then to Isolde. "Speak the severance." She drew in one breath. The whole room waited. And in a voice far steadier than she felt, Isolde said, "I renounce the authority of House Marin over my body, estate, blood, and future from this day onward. I claim no obedience to my father, and he claims no ownership over me." Her father made a choked noise, but the words had already been written down. Lucien signed first. Then he pushed the parchment toward her. The marriage contract included far more than she expected. Separate household funds. Chosen attendants. Full protection under Crown law. No forced unveiling in public or private. No requirement of public intimacy. No access to her body except by clear mutual consent. In the event of pregnancy, full authority over her own confinement and medical care. At the bottom, in the king's own hand, another line had been added. The queen's veil shall remain inviolate unless she herself requests otherwise. Her vision blurred for one unguarded instant. "This is excessive," muttered one gray-haired advisor. Lucien replied without looking at him, "No. It is precise." Isolde signed. Her father refused to look at her as he was escorted out after the council, but her sister did. Elira's eyes shone with guilt and something like grief. Isolde could not bear it. Not yet. She turned away. When the room finally emptied, only she and the king remained. Lucien gathered the sealed contract. It is done. Yes. He studied her for a moment. You are pale. I thought only fair women were allowed that privilege. A pause. Then, very faintly, you are sharper when frightened. And you are colder when kind. That time he did almost smile. It was a dangerous, fleeting thing, but real. We are discovering one another's defects quickly, he said. We're efficient. That is encouraging in a royal marriage. It should not have comforted her. It did. The wedding took place 3 days later beneath blue glass windows and a ceiling painted with winter stars. The cathedral was packed. Nobles glittered in velvet and silver fur. Foreign ambassadors sat like jeweled crows, memorizing every detail for letters home. Ladies of court leaned so far from the pews they looked in danger of tumbling into the aisle. Half the kingdom had come to witness the scandal of their beautiful king marrying the veiled blue daughter no one else would take. Isolde walked alone. Her gown was white, but the veil remained black. Around the edge of her hood, tiny moonstones had been sewn so that they glimmered like a frost line against night. Underneath, her horns had been wrapped and pinned so the cloth draped cleanly over them. At the altar waited Lucien. He wore black and silver. He looked less like a groom than like winter standing upright and waiting to be obeyed. The high priest intoned blessings. The vows began. When it came time for the personal covenant, Lucien turned toward her and said clearly enough for the first rose to hear, I vow this, no hand of mine will force what is not given. Not your face. Not your body. Not your will. A murmur moved through the cathedral. It was not a normal vow. It was too bare, too deliberate, too revealing in its own way. Even behind the veil, Isolde felt every noblewoman in the room hearing the promise and understanding exactly how little freedom women usually had to be promised. Then it was her turn. She looked at him, at the pale calm of his face, at the man who had seen her for less than a week and already built law between her and further harm, and she answered with the only honesty she had. I vow to meet your keeping with truth where I can bear it and courage where I cannot. For the first time, something in Lucien's expression truly changed. A flicker only. But enough to suggest that her words had struck somewhere deeper than ceremony. The rings were exchanged. Then the priest said, You may seal the union. The entire cathedral leaned toward them. This was the moment everyone had come for. The unveiling. The answer. The shock. The proof. Lucien turned slightly toward her. So quietly only she could hear, he asked, Do you wish it? No king should have sounded that gentle in front of an entire kingdom. No, she whispered. He nodded. Then, before all the watching court, he took her hand and kissed her knuckles through the glove. The cathedral inhaled in collective disbelief. He had not lifted the veil. He had meant his vow. 1,000 whispers burst outward at once. Isolde stood very still as the bells began to ring and the priest pronounced them husband and wife, feeling the place his mouth had touched burn like a secret under silk. Their wedding feast lasted hours. Music. Toasts. Endless courses of food. Endless eyes. Endless rumors thickening with every goblet of wine. Isolde sat at Lucien's right hand on the raised dais, speaking when spoken to, letting the noise wash around her. He ate little. Drank almost nothing. Smiled never. Yet whenever some lord or lady grew bold enough to aim a veiled insult at his new queen, his gaze alone turned them mute. By the time they were finally escorted to the royal bedchamber, Isolde was exhausted down to her bones. The room they entered was warm and candlelit, draped in white and gold, the bed curtains tied back, the hearth blazing high. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. For a long moment neither moved. Then Lucien reached into his coat and drew out a folded strip of black silk. Isolde stared. What is that? A blindfold. You brought a blindfold to your own wedding night. Yes. She should have been appalled. Instead she was so startled she nearly laughed. Why? So that if you choose to remain veiled, there is no accidental compromise. The care in that answer hit her like a physical blow. You expected I might be afraid. I expected, he said evenly, that fear has probably been a reliable teacher in your life. Silence. Then he added, if you prefer, we can sleep on opposite sides of the room and speak again tomorrow. It was absurd how much that almost broke her. He was beautiful, cold, powerful, and behaving like a man entering a wounded animal's shelter, slowly, hands visible, careful not to crowd. No one had ever offered her gentleness without demanding gratitude in return. Isolde said, turn around. He did. With shaking fingers, she tied the silk over his eyes. Up close he smelled of cedar, smoke, winter air, and something so clean and sharp it was almost like snow. A small scar touched the edge of his jaw. His hair brushed her wrist. He did not move until she stepped back. There, she said softly. Is that better? Yes. And now? Isolde swallowed. Now. I don't know. His voice lowered. Then we discover it slowly. He came toward her one careful step at a time, stopping near enough for her to feel the unnatural cold radiating from his body. It was not imagination. It was real. His skin, when his fingers touched the back of her hand, was colder than the room should have allowed. She noticed. He noticed that she noticed. Neither spoke of it. When he kissed her, it was with astonishing restraint. Not possessive. Not hungry, not at first. It felt like he was asking the question with his mouth that he had already asked with his actions, will you allow this? Isolde answered by kissing him back. The careful restraint in him frayed immediately. Not into roughness. Into need. Into a hunger he had held too tightly for too long and did not entirely know how to handle when welcomed. Their first night unfolded in darkness and slow trust, with her veil still on, his blindfold still tied, both of them learning one another through voice and breath and touch. Later, when they lay under the blankets, he did not move away at once. His arm remained around her waist. His body was still cold. Isolde, half drunk on exhaustion and relief and the shocking realization that pleasure had not come paired with shame, murmured into the darkness, "You're freezing." He went still. "Am I?" "Yes. I apologize." That was so absurdly formal that she laughed against the pillow. After a beat, she felt the bed shift as he turned slightly toward her. "What is funny?" "You speak like a man who has never shared a bed before." A pause. "Not frequently," he admitted. The answer delighted her far more than it should have. She rolled onto one elbow, forgetting he could not see her through the dark and the blindfold anyway. "Your Majesty." "Lucien," he said quietly. Something in the tone made her chest tighten. "Lucien," she repeated. His hand found hers in the blankets. Neither of them slept for a long time. Their marriage was supposed to remain practical. Instead it became dangerous. By day they were king and queen. By night, increasingly, they became something neither of them had meant to allow. Lucien came to her rooms nearly every evening. Sometimes only to sit by the fire and discuss state business in that dry, precise voice of his while Isolde listened and, eventually, argued back. Sometimes to lie beside her and ask unexpected questions, what the southern coast smelled like in summer, whether horned women braided ribbons around their horns for festivals, what books she liked, which songs her mother used to sing. Sometimes he arrived late and silent, exhausted from counsel, and rested in the chair near her bed while she read aloud until his breathing evened. And always, always, the cold clung to him. His hands were cold. His chest was cold. Sometimes in the middle of the night he woke shivering despite the fire. The first time she tried to feed more logs into the hearth, he caught her wrist gently. "Leave it. You're freezing." "I am always freezing. That is not normal." "No." The answer came too quickly. Isolde looked at him sharply. Even in darkness and a half-loosened blindfold, she could feel the wall rise in him. "What is wrong with you?" "Nothing that concerns you." She let out a disbelieving breath. "I'm your wife." "Yes. And you think what is wrong with your body does not concern me?" Silence. Then, after a long moment, he said, "It is old." "That is not an explanation. It is the only one I am fit to give tonight." The evasion should have angered her. Instead it frightened her. Still, she let it rest. For a time. Then spring began to soften the snowpack, and Isolde realized she was late. The palace healer confirmed it with gentle hands and a smile she barely restrained. "You are with child, your grace." Isolde sat very still. Part of her had known already. Another part had not dared believe anything so enormous could happen inside a life that had felt caged for so long. That night she waited by the fire until Lucien arrived. The moment he entered, he seemed to sense the charged stillness in the room. "What is it?" She rose. "I saw the healer." His face lost what little color it had. "And?" She placed one hand over her stomach. "You are going to be a father." The transformation in him was immediate and devastating. Shock first. Then wonder. Then something so nakedly hopeful it stripped 10 years from his face. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped close enough that the cold of him touched her through the fabric of her gown. "Are you certain?" "Yes." His hand lifted, hovering. "May I?" She caught her breath. "Yes." He laid his palm over her belly as if touching something sacred and terribly fragile. For a moment he simply stood there, eyes closed, breathing as though the world had tilted under him. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "A child." Joy, real joy, lit his voice. It should have made her only happy. Instead, under the happiness, fear bloomed. Because from the beginning, the contract had named one thing above all, an heir. Now the heir existed. Now the practical purpose of their marriage was complete. That night Lucien spoke of nurseries, wet nurses, names, tiny riding ponies years too soon, the old royal cradle kept in storage, what sort of world he wanted their child to inherit. Isolde listened, smiled, answered, and all the while felt terror sharpen beneath her ribs. Would he stop coming once the child was born? Would distance return? Would he save himself by retreating from whatever this had become between them? She did not know how to ask. She was still too cowardly to ask. Their son was born in a storm of late autumn rain. He arrived red-faced and furious and undeniably alive, with a strong cry and a fierce grip. The midwives laughed as they wrapped him. Isolde, trembling with exhaustion, wept into the pillows from sheer relief. When Lucien entered the chamber and saw the child in the midwife's arms, all the unnatural calm that had marked him since she first met him vanished at once. He looked almost afraid to touch the baby. "Take him," Isolde whispered. The midwife placed the child carefully into his hands. Lucien stared down at his son as if language had abandoned him. It changed him, that sight. He had always been beautiful in a remote, dangerous way. But holding the child, with wonder cracking open the severe lines of his face, he looked painfully human. Then he looked at Isolde. And she saw it. Love. Not merely affection. Not need. Not the comfort they had built in secret. Love, full and unhidden at last, blazing straight at her with a tenderness so deep it undid every defense she still possessed. At the same moment, the room grew colder. Subtly at first. Then all at once. Lucien swayed. Isolde pushed herself upright despite the fresh pain in her body. Lucien. He handed the baby back to the midwife too quickly. His free hand went to his chest. The cold in the room deepened. Frost crawled over the silver basin on the washstand. No one moved for one stunned heartbeat. Then Lucien whispered, hoarse and dreadful, "No." Isolde's blood turned to ice. He staggered to the bedpost and caught himself. His skin had gone white, almost blue beneath the eyes. She had seen him cold before. Never like this. What is happening? He looked at her with raw helplessness. I should have told you sooner. Terror flooded her. Told me what? His breath came shallow. There is a curse on the kings of Norvale. The room seemed to tilt. He closed his eyes briefly, as if saying the words cost him. An ancestor feared love would weaken judgment. He took a witch's bargain. The men of his line would rule without the burden of deep attachment. His mouth twisted. Or so he believed. Frost began to spread up the bedpost beneath his hand. Isolde stared in horror. What does the curse do? He opened his eyes. If we love, truly, it wakes. The frost reached his wrist. And then, she whispered. Lucien looked at her with the expression of a man who has known his own death in theory for years and only now discovered he wants desperately to live. And then the cold finishes what it began. The midwives backed away in terror, clutching the infant. Isolde could not breathe. He had chosen her partly because he believed a veiled woman, a secret of marriage, a controlled arrangement could never become dangerous enough to wake whatever slept in his blood. And yet it had. Because against all reason, they had loved anyway. No, she said. No. There has to be something. There wasn't for the men before me. The phrase struck her sharply. Before you? My father died young. My grandfather too. She saw it suddenly. The silence around his health. The fear in the healers. The way nobody spoke plainly. The way the palace had learned to walk around an invisible grave long before she arrived. You knew, she whispered. Yes. And you still married me. He laughed once, brokenly. I married you because I thought I was being clever. The frost spread across the floorboards. Isolde's hands flew to the binding collar at her throat. If anything could fight winter, perhaps it was the fire she had spent half her life chained away from. Lucien saw where she looked. No. Yes. It could kill you. It's already killing you. She tried to rise. Pain tore through her body from childbirth, but fear was stronger. Tell me how to break it. He went silent. That silence told her enough. Blood. Heat. Will. The same old ingredients at the heart of too much magic. The midwives cried out as blue light flickered once beneath Isolde's skin, answering the desperation in her pulse despite the collar's restraints. Lucien reached for her. Isolde, don't. But she had already seized the silver clasp of the blanket and cut her palm open. Blood spilled hot over the ruined iron. The collar blazed. Blue fire erupted around her throat, bright enough to fill the chamber with sea-colored light. The metal cracked. Once. Twice. Then shattered, falling in pieces across the bed. Magic slammed back into her. For 7 years it had been buried under iron and obedience. Now it returned like a storm released. Fire raced through her veins, not orange or red but the fierce impossible blue of her mother's bloodline. It climbed her arms in living ribbons, wreathed her fingers, flashed along the curves of her horns. Lucien stared at her with pain and astonishment mingled. Isolde did not hesitate. She put both blazing hands over his chest. The curse met her like an iceberg under black water. Cold. Ancient. Cruel. A spell built from fear of weakness and hatred of tenderness. It lunged against her magic with killing intent, trying to freeze her blood, trying to devour the fire as soon as it touched it. Isolde gritted her teeth and pushed harder. Under her hands, Lucien made a raw, strangled sound. "You do not get to die because someone centuries ago was too frightened to love," she said through clenched teeth. The blue fire deepened. The frost on his skin began to smoke. The chamber doors burst open. Guards shouted. Wind surged in. The baby cried. None of it mattered. Isolde poured every memory, every rage, every ounce of surviving herself into the spell. Her mother singing to her by candlelight. Her father locking the collar. The platform of unwanted brides. Lucien asking before touching her veil. His blindfold on their wedding night. His hand over their child. His face when he had looked at her and not turned away. Something in the curse cracked. The sound was like a lake of ice breaking at thaw. Then it shattered. A wave of cold exploded outward, extinguishing half the candles in the room. And vanished. Lucien collapsed against her. Warmth touched her palms. For one disbelieving second she could not understand it. Then she realized. He was warm. Not less cold. Warm. She started to cry. The fire around her hands guttered and died. The room smelled of melted frost and scorched linen. The broken collar lay in black pieces across the bed. The midwives stood frozen. The guards at the door looked as if they had accidentally witnessed a god being born. Lucien lifted a trembling hand to her face. At some point in the blast, her veil had burned away. For the first time, he saw her fully. Blue skin, silver-gray eyes, black hair fallen loose, horns gleaming in the shattered candlelight. He looked at her for a long, speechless moment. Then he whispered, with all the wonder in the world, "You are magnificent." A laugh broke out of her through the tears. "That is not the horrified reaction I was promised all my life." His hand traced the line of one horn with reverent fingers. "Then your life was full of idiots." It was such a dry, Lucien answer that she laughed harder and began crying in earnest at the same time. He pulled her carefully against him, newly warm, newly alive, and kissed her as their son wailed in the background and the whole room stood too stunned to speak. The scandal that followed shook the kingdom. The truth of the royal curse emerged within days. Old records were opened. Priests, healers, and terrified archivists confirmed what had been hidden for generations. The kings of Norvale had indeed been chained to a blood curse forged out of fear of love. Witchcraft had been blamed for centuries, persecuted, banned, and buried, while the royal line quietly died young and cold. Lucien, now inconveniently alive and very warm-blooded, responded the way only he could. With law. The ban on magical bloodlines was lifted within the month. Binding collars without due process were declared acts of criminal abuse. 3 lords protested publicly and discovered that the king's patience, though warmer than before, remained limited. 2 more resigned before he could ruin them personally. Lord Marin was arrested under Crown order. Evidence surfaced about unlawful magical restraint, coercive trafficking of his own daughter, and older crimes no one had bothered to examine while his status protected him. Elira testified, pale and shaking, that she had long suspected their father lied about much and feared the rest. Isolde did not forgive her immediately. But she allowed her into the nursery weeks later, and that was a beginning. The court adapted with suspicious speed, as courts always do when power changes direction. Ladies began wearing horn-shaped silver combs in what they called admiration. Poets wrote absurd ballads about the horned queen of blue flame. Children in the city began leaving little ribbons tied to wrought iron fences, for the fire queen's luck, much to the annoyance of the palace guards. As for Lucien, he spent the first weeks after the curse broke touching heat like a man returned from exile. Teacups. Sun-warmed window glass. His son's warm cheek. Isolde's bare hands, her face, the smooth curve of her horns. He could not stop looking at her. This became one of Isolde's private joys. "You've already seen me," she told him once while feeding the baby near the nursery hearth. "You don't need to stare as if I'll vanish." He leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, and said with that maddening calm, "I am reacquainting myself with my astonishingly beautiful wife." She nearly dropped the blanket. "Do not say things like that while I'm holding the child." "Why?" "Because I need at least one hand free to throw something at you." He smiled. An actual smile. Open and warm and nothing like the cold weapon he had once turned on his court. It still shocked her every time. Their son, named Cassian, had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth. Sometimes, when upset, he made the room noticeably cooler. When delighted, faint blue sparks danced over his fingers. The royal nurses found this alarming for almost a week. After that they began taking bets on which parent he resembled more while pretending not to. In the quiet hours, when the palace finally slept, Isolde and Lucien would sit together in the solar overlooking the mountains. He would rest with one arm around her while she read or simply watched the snowmelt glitter far below. Sometimes they talked about governance, about rebuilding law, about the families who had suffered under magical persecution. Sometimes they talked about nothing important at all. One evening, months later, Isolde asked, "Why did you really choose me?" Lucien looked up from where Cassian slept against his shoulder. "I told you. You told me the practical version. And now you want the foolish one?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because everyone else in that hall was trying to be chosen." That stung more than she expected. "And I was not." "No," his gaze held hers. "You were trying not to be broken in public. You were furious. And afraid. And proud. And standing there like a fortress pretending it had never been set on fire." The words stole her breath. "I thought," he said softly, "if there was any person in that room who might understand what it is to live inside something cold and weaponized, it would be you." She swallowed hard. Then, because she was still herself and sentiment required balancing, she said, "So you picked me because I looked difficult." He considered. "Extremely." She laughed. Cassian stirred, made a tiny outraged noise, and settled again. Lucien looked down at their son, then back at her, and the expression in his eyes was so gentle it still frightened her sometimes, not because she feared him, but because part of her still had not learned how to survive being loved without condition. "I was meant to choose safety," he said. "Instead I chose you." Isolde touched his face, warm beneath her fingers. "Good. Good. Yes. I would have hated becoming queen for a man with poor taste." That made him laugh, low and helpless and very unlike the Ice King the kingdom had once feared. She kissed him. Not through a veil. Not in darkness. Not while either of them hid from what this was. Outside, evening settled over Norvale in bands of blue and silver. Snow still crowned the far mountains. The palace windows glowed gold against the dark. Somewhere in the city below, a bell rang the hour. Long ago, in another version of her life, Isolde might have remained a hidden daughter and an ugly rumor. A blue-horned woman sold from one cage to another while people whispered about what was wrong with her. Instead she became the woman a king chose in a room full of rejection. The woman who broke the curse in his blood. The woman who stepped out of concealment not because the world had earned the sight of her, but because love had. And if the kingdom insisted on turning that into a legend, well. For once, the legend was true.